Hello and welcome to this week's SMAF, SM Advanced Forum. I'm Eric Schumacher Rasmussen, the editor of streamingmedia.com, and we've got our usual crew of hosts. Dom Robinson, hello.
That was me touching my mic as usual, just to, yeah, it always pops the signal over to me. Hello, everyone. How are you? SMAF again. We're back. It's May.
And Mark East is with us again. Mark, how you doing?
Hello. I'm great. How about you?
Excellent, excellent. And Tim Siglin, down in Tennessee.
Yes, sir. With the whole world behind me, apparently, on the wall, at least.
It always is. You've got the whole world at your back, I guess.
Yeah, not in my hands, but just
right. And this week we are joined by Darcy Lorincz. Darcy, how you doing?
Doing great, thanks.
Good, good. For folks who don't know Darcy's a veteran of the streaming media industry. He's been around almost as long as the industry has, maybe even longer. Darcy, you want to just give us give people a brief introduction about who you are, what your background is, and what you're doing now?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Eric. Well, maybe not as long as some of you guys, but 96 was my first foot in the door. So I guess it's been a while. Seems like yesterday. Long journey from 96 to today, where we're seeing our space out in front versus back then when it was a postage size stamp and crappy audio and streams that didn't work. So it's been a great journey. Had a journey from telecom through consulting, through having my own businesses in this space. And today it's more exciting than ever. So I'm happy to join you guys and look forward to having this session today.
Great to hear. Let's pass things back over to Tim Siglin. I'm going to talk a little bit about Streaming Media East, but at this point, probably makes sense to come back to that to wrap up the event. So, Tim, why don't you get us rolling with this week's topics?
All right. And for this week, I think a couple of things we're going to do is walk through Flipboards. Of course, we're going to come back and talk to Darcy on a few topics. But Dom, one of the ones that you sort of pointed out from a topic this week is Cisco. Cisco has Videoscape. They bought it from NDS. I believe Eric told me it was $5 billion when it was initially acquired. What's the sale price, Dom, that they're talking about at this point?
Oh, you caught me out there. Hold on, let me just bring it up, and I'll try and. We're going to try something new with the tech this week, and actually try using traditional screen sharing to share the Flipboard with you rather than my scan converter, which is horrible. So hopefully you can see it a bit better this week.
There it is.
There we go.
Pulling up the story. Yeah, they bought it in 2012 from NDS and Primera, and they're selling it back to Primera for $1 billion now. Bought it for $5 billion, selling it for $1 billion.
So what's the sense in the industry at this point then, from Cisco's standpoint? And I've got some history with Cisco. Before I was in streaming, I was in video conferencing, and of course, Cisco owns sort of the network core, but they've always tried to do these add-ons, and it seems sometimes they just don't really get a home run with any of them. Is the sense in the industry that Cisco couldn't figure out video, or is the sense that Cisco needs to focus on something else other than what it had built Videoscape into? Because Videoscape wasn't just NDS assets, it also had some of the inlet assets. And I'll throw that open to any of you, including Darcy, since Darcy, I know you've got a fairly good grasp on the industry.
Well, I mean, my sense is that you're right, Tim, that they never really quite figured out what to do with the Videoscape business. They always made a big splash at NAB and IBC, always had huge booths, meetings, parties, but never really saw much in the way of customers using what they've got. I mean, they always said they had customers, and I think one of the major 3-letter networks was one of them, but I can't recall which. But they always seem to be more hype than actual functionality. I don't know if that's the sense other people got, but that was always my take on it.
Something that's always baffled me about Cisco is I think they've always they make these strange moves into the video world. And then lose the plot completely. The FlipCam acquisition is the one that always stands out for me. FlipCam was a genius product. Nothing that I could ever have associated with Cisco, and it was dead before they'd even the ink had dried on the deal. That was the most bizarre acquisition. And then shortly after, they announced they were coming into the video world, and I think that was quite scary because at the time, certainly, they were an enormous company, really powerful influence in the industry. But then they just never seemed to follow through. They kept making strange acquisitions, but just never really followed through. Well, maybe that's just me, but.
And it's interesting you say that, Dom, because they bought Lynx's, which is the home networking, and ended up ultimately they were going to get rid of the name. They went to Cisco for the name for some of the home networking products, and then they brought the Lynx's brand back because the Lynx's brand was stronger home networking standpoint than Cisco was. Plus, there were questions within the core business at Cisco as to whether or not they were cannibalizing some of their sales because they were offering these lower cost switches. I'd forgotten about FlipCam. That's actually a really.
Yeah, I thought FlipCam is just a weird one. It was such a neat little product. It was of its day, and it was almost like they bought it to take it out of the market. It was
right,
because
everyone loved it. Everyone loved that product.
Yeah, and it was groundbreaking at the time.
It seems like everything Cisco does except routing is taking it off the market, but I think it's not a result of anything other than they don't focus on the things they buy, and it's about buzz, as you guys said, trade show buzz, industry buzz, but are they really doing any good job at running the business? You look at, I'm spending some time with Niagara these days, so they have competing products and they do a fine job, and it keeps growing for them. So something to be said about making purchases and not putting your eye on the ball. And having been in some multinationals that acquired my businesses, I could tell you that that's just a kind of a prototype for get relevant for a few months or years, and don't put your eye on the ball. And when it gets boring or doesn't serve your purpose for your story, get rid of it.
I also think that it's going to put a lot of heat on Ericsson. Frankly, I think of any, if I was running any of those companies or any of the big boy companies in the sector at the moment, and I saw this going on with NDS, Cisco, their media team, I would be considering where I'm going with my business. I think Ericsson, they seem to be similar in that sense. They dabble, and I think it is dabbling. I think they jump on the buzz, but I just haven't seen them really lock into gear. They're not good. They don't have the maturity or the respect that on the sort of street level broadcast engineer to say this stuff is just the best stuff, you've got to buy it. Most people go, yeah, they took over something and they kind of I don't know, but I don't want to get sued.
Does Ericsson need any more heat? To think they're already in the fire, aren't they?
Yes, I think that's what I was trying to say.
Good luck getting a premium on their media assets when Cisco is getting rid of theirs on a fire sale. So we'll see how that goes.
And Darcy, if I understand correctly, you did some work with Accenture for a while. Right?
Correct. Yeah, spent 8 years there, 7 lovely years.
Okay, and I did work with Ernst & Young and Capgemini in the space as well. So one of the things I think that sort of strikes me here, Dom, as you talk about the big boys, is a lot of these are telecom or core IP delivery networks trying to figure out how to enhance their business by buying up endpoint solutions. I mean, Polycom obviously got acquired. PictureTel before that from the video conferencing space that I was in. Like I said, when I did work with Cisco, and what we would find is every 7 months they would change their strategy, and ultimately they'd rehire us to do market analytics to figure out what the new strategy looked like. But to Darcy's point, eye off the ball in that period of time, you're just spending a whole lot of money and not really having anything to show for it beyond your core.
Yeah, re-engineering yourself every year was the state of the game at that consultancy. And I mean, of course, that's what they do. They try and be relevant to the story of the day. And if the story changes at the end of the fiscal year, then it's about restructuring the story. And I always say when I'm blogging about this stuff, wait till the end of August to see what the new stories are from the big boys, because they have to change. They got a lot of momentum to build, and they can't build it around stories. So at some point they just keep changing the story to maintain their relevance.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Ericsson in this conversation. Well, both Dom and Darcy did. Here's a little plug. Ericsson will be giving the keynote at the Content Delivery Summit next week. And so hopefully we'll find out a little bit more about what their plans are. They've been getting some attention, but as you said, Dom, and in the past, that attention has never really turned into anything material. So it's going to be interesting to see if they actually announce anything. I don't know for sure that they will, but I suspect they might. So we may know a little bit more about what Ericsson's plans are a week from now.
I think it's really complicated for big blue chips in this space. This is a disruptors market at the moment. And if you've been selling big iron in the telco space for a long time, it makes sense when you see a disruptor coming in to, you're the big guys, surely you can pick it up and accelerate it. But when you've got so much momentum in a particular direction and something is disrupting the market, I think culturally it's very difficult for the big blue chips to make that internal change. And certainly it's taken Ericsson a long time to really clearly position what they're doing and clearly explain why moving from moving into the appliance space in a market that's moving out of appliances into a virtualized space, and then as they start to develop that product and introduce it into the market, moving into the network operations space is weird. Ericsson, they're not network operators. They supply kit for network operators. So UDN is challenging for me. I mean, maybe they are perfectly positioned to do it, but really, I don't know. I'm going to put them on I'm going to put them on the spot at the Content Delivery Summit next week for sure.
That's going to be good. I think the 5G hasn't come fast enough for them, and as you said, they're a kit company. So I think there's the lifeline. If 5G finally emerges in the next 18 months, that'll be Ericsson's focal point, and all this other noise will go away.
Yeah, and ultimately, telecoms always have that problem, or telecom equipment companies have that problem of, do they try to drive a market forward by doing an in-house solution, or do they try to entice third parties to drive the market forward so that more of their kit's purchased? And in the old days for telecoms, it was, if it was MCI or Sprint or AT&T, it was, do you build out services to sell minutes or to sell bits, or do you just sell the minutes and bits and hope that services come along to allow that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's what was the company that Cisco bought to kick off their media group? It was Inlet, wasn't it?
Inlet, yep.
Inlet, yeah. And Inlet was such an innovator in its day. They were they were the big boys who they were the upstart that knocked Digital Rapids off their pedestal really at the time. And then Elemental really came along and filled the gap that Cisco created by buying Inlet. I think that's my picture of the last sort of decade of big encoding guys.
Well, to your earlier point, I think had Cisco managed that properly, they could have withstood the onslaught from Elemental, and I don't think that's what happened there.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, right about the time that acquisition happened, about 7 months before that, I did the best workflows. It was 2010, early 2011. NDS and Inlet were bought at about the same time, but they were bought by two different groups within Cisco, who then had to figure out how to push those two together. So I remember talking to some of the Inlet people after the Cisco acquisition, and essentially what they had, they were having to dismantle and flow into the model of the NDS videoscape. And I think that's the other problem, is you get, hey, if video is a good idea, rather than buying one company, we buy two. But then you've got three corporate cultures that have to be merged together, which is absolutely difficult for small companies coming into multinationals. So let's see. One of the other topics that is in the Flipboard, Dom, was about AV1, and we've heard quite a bit about AV1 the last few weeks. I believe it was, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but Netflix has come out and said essentially AV1 is going to be one of their codecs of choice in the not too distant future, I think by the end of the year. Now Facebook is saying they're adding AV1 support. I know we rely on you, Mark, fairly heavily when we've talked about things like Flash in the past. you're on the ground doing production. What's your sense of interest in AV1 from a live event standpoint, from an on-demand standpoint, versus sticking with AVC versus HEVC? I know that's a broad question, but just trying to get a sense, because I am doing some surveys that I'm hearing HEVC is there's a lot of interest in it. Obviously, now that the licensing issues are taken sort of taken off the table, but AV1 clearly has backing of a number of companies, including Cisco. So I'm just curious what your sense, Mark, is on AV1 as a whole.
I'm just not sure how much interest there is from a live production perspective or from a live content creation perspective in AV1 now that the licensing issues are less fraught than they were with HEVC. We've been looking at HEVC for a long time and trying to figure out when it was going to be relevant to our business, because AVC has been, good enough for many, many years. So, I don't think we're looking at AV1 right now. The adoption just isn't there yet. And, Facebook notwithstanding, I think HEVC is still where it's at for a lot of live content creators.
And what would it take to move people? If people move off AVC, what will it take for them to make a decision between HEVC and AV1? Or is the sense that, as you say, now that licensing is addressed, it's a natural flow from AVC to HEVC?
I think that's the latter is the case there. I think a jump to AV1 is kind of, changing ecosystems a bit. So, I at least as far as I'm concerned, as far as we're concerned, the logical step is HEVC, and in terms of hardware and software solutions out there that support HEVC, that that's been years in the making, whereas AV1 is kind of starting from scratch at this point. So, I think the leap is coming within the next year, and HEVC is where it's at for us, at least.
Can I? I'm going to jump in there. Can I ask a question across to Darcy? Darcy, you're doing some work with Nagra at the moment. You guys must be doing cost-benefit analysis of different codecs and in your propositioning and so on and so forth. I get the cost. Well, although I always think it's misrepresented, HEVC is always represented as being able to deliver higher quality. Actually, it delivers lower bandwidth for the same quality. I think that's the important. For me, that's the important thing, because like Mark, I tend to focus on live, and lower bandwidth for the same quality is the key thing. But which is a fairly obvious benefit from jumping from H.264 to H.265. But moving from H.265 to AV1, I'm not sure that the cost benefit's there. I get the licensing makes a difference, and obviously that's part of it. But what are you finding? Are you finding that there's a good story to tell yet?
I haven't heard any good stories. And of course, then you got a forklift and you have a bunch of new things to do and worry about in operations. And, not only are we at Nagra managing 500 million set tops out there in the world, forklifting that into new world is tough. Companies like Beamer are making HEVC much more attractive. Their quality and their throughput, they're definitely going the right way and using less bandwidth for much higher quality. And, I don't know. I'd say I wouldn't worry about this for a year, maybe 2 years, and see where it goes. Of course, cost will come into play, and I know AV1's finally putting some moves in, but I think I don't think it's all been sorted as far as I know. I haven't seen that the open source stuff is really making its way in there either. So and on the gaming side, it's a non-starter. There's really a lot of back channel and interactivity we're doing on interconnecting all these game rigs, and AV1's a non-starter.
So let me ask a follow-on question to that, Darcy, though, because you've got all these set-top boxes that you're dealing with. What about VP9? Has VP9 been part of any scenario that you've been working with? Because that's the argument that I hear is, if you're on VP9, go to AV1, as opposed to if you're on HEVC, go to AV1. So has VP9 been part of the ecosystem you've had to deal with?
No.
Okay.
Simple answer, no. Again, why? Cost benefits. Everybody that you guys talked about encoding. Now we're talking about some standards, but it's everybody's benefit to keep this noisy and have their little special part of the world. And you find something that works and it's got a cost benefit and it's scalable, and like we're scaling out in esports, and we have support for sports forever, and obviously on these set top installations, it works. It's getting better. The competing interests will find their place, but I haven't found the need, or I haven't heard a need in any of the businesses that I'm involved with to even look outside of what we're doing right now.
Okay.
So I just wanted to chip in. Just an interesting comment. I think I was talking. There's a guy I work with quite a lot on doing some audio production stuff, and he works with the local BBC News crew and so on. And he often looks with quite a lot of fascination at the pragmatism I have as a webcaster with my audio webcasting. You know, he's brought up in, well, he works in a world of AES 67 Pro audio. You know, everything's got to be done in a specific way. And there were we were having a chat over a beer about a week ago, and there were two things which definitely raised an eyebrow with him and caused some amusement. The first one was that I told him that I generally webcast audio in mono. And he was confused by that. You know, he's like, well, but we've got this world of infinite bandwidth, and we've got. And I told him a story about how when I'd started streaming with dial-up connections, actually, whenever you stream with mono, you get a much better dynamic range. And the analogy, which is the really simple one for our generation to understand, is you're using the full width of the tape. You're not splitting the tape into two channels and halving your dynamic range. And he was definitely quite surprised by that. And the other one, which is a bit more of a throwaway, that I think is relevant to the to the cost benefits of compression and so on. Quite often you can do more with old codecs. I'm still a great fan of H.264. It's low power, it's cheap, it's pervasive, it's really good at what it does. There's nothing wrong with H.264. Maybe some patent questions, but you know, there's nothing wrong with it. And pretty soon people will lose interest in patenting it like they have with MP3, and it's going to become even more ubiquitous. And I think that's really important. You know, MP3 is a bloody good codec. And it's done nothing wrong for the years. The other thing that this is a bit of a throwaway comment, but it might stimulate some interesting chat. He asked me why the dominant layout of my webcasting kit was RCA stereo based, line stereo based, rather than XLR with phantom power running everywhere and so on. And I explained to him that actually,
like a true audio engineer, right?
Well, what was interesting was I told him that when I was webcasting sort of late 90s through the early 2000s a lot, and doing really dominantly audio webcasting for clubs and you know, various different news broadcasts and so on. When I turned up to the event, the only available connection to plug into was the tape out on the audio desk. It was always available because nobody knew how it worked or what it did, so nobody plugged anything into it. And you turn up with a stereo RCA connector and say, and the sound engineer would be staring at you going, I don't know what to do with that. Haven't you got something with XLRs and lots of high voltage in it? And I'd say, no, I'll just plug into that tape out on the back of your desk and I'm going to have an absolutely beautiful feed, and it will always be available because nobody uses it. So I think it's really important not to keep chasing the new keep chasing the new sparkly things when there's lots and lots of stuff out there that's really good at what it does and really does the job perfectly. Mark,
I think it's also you know, a key thing that we're not mentioning here that we have mentioned before, and we have talked about, you know, kind of the race for the new codecs before, but it's all about content. And until there's a need for, you know, much higher efficiency with 4K content or 8K content or whatever the case may be, you know, there's really no need for me as a live content creator to leap to anything from HEVC or sorry, from AVC. I think AVC is just fine for what we're doing today, and HDR won't increase the bandwidth requirements much. So I believe that we're good where we are for now. Once we get into 4K and 8K content on a live basis, on a regular basis, then I think, you know, we'll start considering the new sparkly things a little bit more.
And somebody said earlier, don't fix it if it's not broken. And if you get something that's at scale and works for you, I think just stay where you are. But I mentioned earlier about 5G, and I think I'd hold tight to see what's happening with 5G and network slicing, and who's going to do the best job of taking advantage of what 5G is going to do for the world in terms of contribution and even some distribution. You know, LTE broadcast or whatever they're going to call it. I would wait. I wouldn't do anything, and because everything's going to be connected to these new 5G networks, your wire is going to be gone in a few years, and I just don't know who's going to step up to it. And I've seen some great stuff. I mentioned Beamer, and I've seen some other guys, and they're all thinking about mobile and when that pipe gets bigger and what to do with slicing and prioritization. And a lot of these codecs aren't thinking about that. So I would just, for us, we're sitting back and waiting. Everything works great. HEVCs are where we're at. Cost performance is perfect, and why break it? And I think 5G will change everything. So 18 months from now, would you want to make another change if you've made the wrong move? I don't know.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the mobile space, Darcy, because companies that we tend to forget about who are doing really well just being sort of quiet. I think back to Media Excel, who was one of the first companies to do a DSP-based encoder. John Gill and those guys, I worked with them really early on, and they went for Mobi TV and some of the others. So they were playing sort of halfway in the telecom space, halfway in the mobile space, making a boatload of cash on that scenario, precisely for the fact that they could use 3GP and they could use some of the other older codecs and then move up to AVC when the time came. You mentioned Beamer, and I'm not going to give away a secret, but in doing a survey recently where we talked about AVC adoption, AVC workflows, and HEVC, there's some really interesting things that have come out, and I think Beamer will be able to capitalize on from the standpoint of if you own not just the codec, but also the workflow, like a transcoder, and we gave Beamer an NAB, a best of NAB from streamingmedia.com. If you own both of those parts, people can actually do an AVC workflow, integrate HEVC into it, see how it works, and then decide whether they're getting good enough out of AVC or have a compelling reason to move to HEVC. So that there's really a beauty of being able to live in a workflow scenario that lets you use both of those codecs so that you can transition over at the time when there's either, as Mark says, enough content, or if there are enough set-top boxes or devices out there that can decode HEVC. So,
well, I was going to chime in, Tim and Darcy. You had mentioned esports, and in addition to your work with Nagra, you've done a lot of work with esports. And whenever the topic of esports comes up, it's something we haven't covered much on this show. And I think it's something that still doesn't quite get the attention it deserves. I always think back to 2016 when Twitch was on keynotes at Streaming Media East. And, I would say more than half of the room really, if they'd heard of Twitch, but they really hadn't experienced or understood what Twitch was all about. It seems like the rest of the streaming industry is still kind of lagging behind, picking up what's going on in the world of esports. And Darcy, I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the esports arena, pun intended, and what the rest of the streaming industry can learn from that.
Well, the first and foremost is it's not one way, it's bi-directional, because usually you're gaming or doing multiplayer type of gaming, so it has a lot more pressure on the network, and you certainly need a better network to do the latency side of things. Good stories coming out of places like Limelight and how they're supporting low latency, and there's others, but you can't avoid the numbers. There's 2.5 billion casual gamers. There's over 400 million of those are serious, on a daily basis. And you just have to look at the new Twitch numbers. I mean, we launched Justin TV before they were even a going concern way back in my Origin Digital days. And I wondered what are these people doing playing games online? But I've learned a lot, since that, 12 years ago, and supported a lot of big events, rollouts with MLG and Red Bull and other companies. And it's a different world. The latency, the bi-directional capability, gaming across networks is much different than what we're doing here. Even just sending a broadcast stream out. There's not much interactivity except our audio here. In gaming, it's deadly if you have the latency kills you, jitters out, the expectations are high. You switch to mobile a little bit. There's 325 million downloads of a mobile game from EA. That puts pressure on the mobile network, and I think they're going to be so happy, EA, when ultimately there's a new network to support that, because I know they're pull their hair out, I'm sure, when congestion happens, and mobile is deadly for that right now, but it'll change. So, what we've seen definitely in the last 2 years is, a massive amount of usage. The Twitches are proving there's scale to this thing, but they're not the only ones. The tournament side of things, where they're streaming out of these massive tournaments, getting things that we always saw at events. It's no different than any other event streaming, except now you've got interactivity, you've got social chat, and you've got, all the talk back and everything that goes through these things is all happening all at once. Multi-millions of flash crowds showing up for these things. They're beating records of streaming almost on a weekly basis these days. So I'd say that, everybody should wake up and see, number one, how is this affecting your business? If you're already streaming something, these guys are stealing capacity off networks. You're probably going to have some effect somewhere if you've got if you're in sports or other places and you need that high quality and reliability. I love when people say infinite bandwidth and all this nonsense, because they're filling the pipes fast, and the reliability and requirements and the bidirectional nature of the business, it's going to take networks down. When you have 300 million people playing a game, and they're showing up by the millions every day, and they're interacting with each other across the world, there's no boundaries to it. Everybody loves esports. There's really no, of course, Asia is a little bit more advanced than it is in Europe, than it is in the US, but the groundswell is coming fast. So I wouldn't ignore it for a lot of reasons. I wouldn't ignore it as a network operator. I wouldn't ignore it from what it takes to make it happen for your customers if you're in that business from a supplier perspective. And you can't ignore the numbers that are pouring into it from both financial investment and also interest. Brands are trying to find that elusive 18 to 35-year-old, and they're making their way in there, and they won't tolerate bad experiences. So the streaming market's got to catch up. I'd say we're usually ahead. I think in esports we're behind, and we're starting to get further behind. So there's time to wake up and pick up our socks and move ahead.
Yeah, I think from a network perspective, we do a lot of esports work, and we're a little behind. But the experience is generally pretty good from a viewership perspective. I think when it comes to the interactivity, you have a little bit of a lag there. It's a regular occurrence to have viewership in the 500,000 range for even lesser events, not championship events, not very large tournaments, but some invitational event will have, if there's a large, a big well-known streamer involved, you'll have 500,000 people watching, that sort of thing. And if that's, let's say, on Twitch, the chat is useless. The interactivity there, it's going by so fast that it's absolutely useless. So I think the next leap for the Twitches of the world and the Mixer group at Microsoft, the next leap is improving that user interactivity and that experience, and that to Darcy's point, is going to rely on low latency technologies. And I thought it was interesting at NAB this year to see a lot of companies focused on esports, from the broadcast, the big broadcast providers like EVS and Ross, to Akamai and streaming oriented providers, content delivery networks, etc. Everyone's kind of focused on how do we get in, how do we get some of this esports money, and how do we make the experience better for everybody. So I think it's going to end up being a lot of two-way interactivity moving forward, whether that harnesses like WebRTC or similar technologies. I think everyone's looking into building interactivity into their apps. I'm not sure exactly what Twitch and Mixer and to a lesser extent YouTube Gaming have in their back pocket at this point. But I foresee a future in the next, I would say, year or two, where you've got large streamers able to pull their viewers into their broadcasts directly through whatever app they're using to stream, and interact with them and play games with them and that sort of thing, because there'll be a sub 1 second latency. So I think that's exciting.
You guys have limitations on betting, right, over in the States?
Yeah, but I was just going to jump on that, because it's laying on heavily, and if the bettors are looking for one thing, and the odds makers and the online gamers, connecting those two, they're trying to figure it out right now. And when you see the betting that happens right now, it's unwatchable. You've got you've got bettors trying to make in-game calls, and unfortunately the game's past you before you have a chance. And so I think before they get too far along on the wagering side, we got to fix up the side of the latency and make sure that they can deliver. You already have to put a stream in under 2 seconds for anything to be viable for online betting and beat a phone call. And if you've taken all this time up to get this interactivity and the chat and all the other things that are happening, and you try and deliver that payload to millions of viewers, and then you have people that are actually wagering, it's a tough business. So I think we got to, again, picking up the message on latency. The low latency networks aren't just about delivery anymore. It's about end to end. You've got to be able to get to the gamer's location, make sure you can onboard them, and get that message to millions of people. And there are also interactivity happening. Not like just a bunch of cameras pointing at a field or a stick and ball sport anymore. It's a whole bunch of people gaming across the network and then delivering that payload to millions of viewers. That's not true, by the way, in the events business. And unfortunately, we're all kind of caught up in this idea that esports is about people getting into a stadium and us watching it like we do in normal sports. And of course, they followed that kind of methodically because they want to make it look and feel kind of like what you're used to in sports. But the reality is that's a sliver of what's going on in esports. There's millions of games a day. There's tournaments, competitions in colleges and in local communities and in theaters like we're doing with CinemaCon or with the My Cinema product. So I think the networks are not ready, and it's a lot of lifting for an esports company when you start looking at distributed players and distributed audiences. That's not kind of true in most streaming. You got the single event that you're streaming out to the world. In this case, you've got the event is a whole bunch of disparate contributors that actually have to come together before you can experience it. And of course, it comes out of a server in some cloud somewhere. And I think I like that Amazon owns Twitch, because if they didn't, I don't think Twitch would be nearly as successful. What infrastructure would they need to be successful with all the millions of games going on every day and tens of millions of users? Can you imagine the money they'd have to spend? I'd like to look at their books sometime at Twitch and see exactly really how much infrastructure and resources they're using in encoding and transcoding and delivery and contribution. It's got to be a massive amount of the Amazon AWS infrastructure being thrown at this thing. And I think they've got a false sense of reliability and quality in Twitch world from a viewer perspective. And anybody else trying to get in there that's not got that kind of foundation is going to have a fun ride.
So sorry, guys, what is the regulation stateside about online betting? Is it blanket banned? Is it legal?
Yeah. No, it's banned. There's talk about it coming forth in terms of kind of regionalizing it. So, but right now you can't do it. It's impossible. And you obviously can't join the offshore or anything. So yeah.
Exactly. And that was the reason, Dom, is there isn't a way to tax or regulate it like regular gaming, say in Atlantic City or Las Vegas. And what happened was when pressure was applied, they all moved offshore. So it became Cayman, etc. And then suddenly it became a banking regulation issue as well. So to Darcy's point, yeah, it's fully banned. It's a blanket ban.
So are people betting in Bitcoin and crypto?
Well, actually, in esports, it's skin trading, and if you know what skins are, it's all the special things you can make that make your gun in a shooter game look special, or your car in a driver game look different than the others. And there's skins that come from different companies, and players make their own skins. And my son is a gamer in Fortnite and other things, and he shows me these things. People paying $2,000 or £1,000 for a skin on their character or their weapon or their car or whatever their game they're playing. It's crazy. So they ended up there was a loophole, and I see it starting to close now, where you could trade skins. And then ultimately there's skins trading places. That's all they do. You bring your skin to like a Steam and you cash it in. And I think that cashing in is where people got wise in the regulatory side finally in the last little while, and they're starting to clamp down on it. But and then you mentioned crypto. That's obvious, that's going to emerge. There's no doubt. It's easy to do micropayments and handle that kind of a volume and not paying out all of those, Visa royalties as you're doing this thing. So yeah, a lot of the people are right across sports, by the way. It's not just esports. Crypto's coming right across loyalty programs, having the ability to have your own currency and not have to, pay the bank or pay the credit card companies for processing. That is coming fast. And, especially in sports where loyalty is important, you can trade in your loyalty points, your crypto for, for merchandise or swag or tickets to things or events. That's where, that there's a lot of things going on in that space. It's probably worthy of having a whole show on just what's happening in crypto and blockchain around sports and esports.
Does that change the incentive for investment from the larger blue chip players in the network and streaming space to invest in latency for the sake of betting? Where over here there's quite a lot of activity in that space. It's all about low latency. Isn't about hearing your that horrible anecdote, which I still don't believe, about hearing your neighbor clapping cheering a goal before you see it. It's just the only story you hear from the stateside, and I just don't believe it, because I just don't believe it. Call me a cynic, but this side of the water, it's all about betting. How late you can close that tote gate, how late you can close that how late you can close that betting gate. And the interesting thing is you have much larger resource in the networks and streaming media space for innovation around latency. But if the motivation is simply ultimately about getting subscription models for sports there, it's kind of really, it's like, what's my overall package? Is it cheap enough? Is it good enough? Am I cord cutting sports watcher? That's one thing. Whereas over here, if latency makes a difference to the odds on your betting game and to the I'm not saying that everyone in Europe or in the UK is addicted to gambling, but it certainly notionally creates a fertile environment for innovation around latency, which may have a different motivation stateside.
Well,
I would actually be intrigued to. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Because you're not gaming in the US online doesn't mean that all the games aren't going to some betting house. So I would say, if you're a provider, a content owner, or producer, or somebody in that side of there's a good chance that what you're producing is making its way to some eyeballs that are wagering, and the chances are increasing. So everybody's thinking about it. That's besides the ability to get subscribers and advertisers, the ability to have a product that can be wagered on somewhere outside of the US is absolute. And the problem with esports, just to put a cherry on that, is how do you bet on something you can't regulate, or you don't know who the players are, or so there's lots of work to be done still on ranking and figuring out how to regulate this space, and really nobody's emerged in that respect. Once that happens and there's some normalization there, then you'll see a whole lot more betting and the pent up demand for it. I mean, I get calls and conversations with betting folks that I know across the world, and they're all hungry for this esports content, but there's still barriers from quality side, but there's also just the business side of things. It's not well regulated. You don't know if people are cheating in a game. It's very tough business to figure out. And the odds makers, of course, if they don't know the ranking of these players and they don't know where they came from, and all of a sudden you're trying to figure it out, how do you actually set the odds? That's the whole point of wagering is the odds side of things. So I think there's work to be done there still. The latency, network side, got to sort that, and then at scale, I don't think it's still there. And I think on the other side, the regulation. But when those two come together, and I'll predict it'll happen this year, because there's so much pull on this and there's so much revenue opportunity on the wagering side. It'll get sorted. And companies like Limelight, we've been working with them on latency and with Net Insight, trying to figure out what we can do to harmonize and get the lowest latency for the payload we're delivering. And we're seeing great results. So I don't know what it's going to look like when there's actually a lot of traffic there, because we're testing, but it's encouraging. And the ones that focus on it are ones that are going to actually make the money. There's way more money in those bits when there's money being bet on them than there is just delivering it for an ad purpose for CPMs or some subscriber. Definitely is an uptick.
It's interesting to note too that you know, when we're talking about low latency applications for esports, there's a pushback as we start to get more bona fide regulatory bodies for esports. There's a pushback on going too low latency so as to defeat things like screen sniping. If I can, you know, if I can run the live stream of the tournament I'm competing in and look at where somebody is on the map, et cetera, and go find them and kill them, that's a problem for a regulatory board. And as I think we've started to see a fast track, one of our customers is Allied Esports, and they just opened this new esports arena at Luxor in Las Vegas. And because it's in Nevada, they're you know, subject to the Nevada Gaming Control Board and their burgeoning esports regulations. And so we've started to see a lot more involvement from the authorities, as it were, as to what we can and can't do in a live broadcast. And so I think that's the wave of the future, right?
You have to take your mic off, Tim. We can't hear what we're talking about next. You're muted.
No, I was going to say, it's funny that Mark mentions that, because I was walking down the strip and I saw this giant esports gaming arena banner on the side of the Luxor. I was curious what that was.
Yeah, it makes it look like the entire pyramid is a giant esports arena, but yeah.
that was what was happening. It was like they were selling the Luxor and just making it an esports arena.
Right. I mean, it is definitely their big ticket item at this point. It's an interesting model because it's an esports arena when they have a tournament there, but it's also a around the clock. It's not 24/7, but it's a you know, an all day entertainment destination where you can go in and pay a fee and sit down and play games in there, you know, on the big screens with the big players and that sort of thing. And so it's a draw for tourism as well.
Yeah, I blogged about them a while ago, and you know, good for the folks building these facilities or retrofitting existing places. You know, a dead casino now is a esports destination. That's awesome. It puts emphasis on, you know, the higher end of the business. I would loosely call it esports, because to be honest, it's a bunch of guys gaming on a stage in a single place and they stream it out. So is that really a competition or a league, or is it just another event? But you know, there's arguments across the business, so I'm not going to get into that. But ultimately, what's esports and what's gaming is there's definitely some different definitions of that space.
Well, and Darcy,
yeah,
to that point,
there's 8 different efforts in Vegas alone to build out facilities within casinos to attract the audience. By the way, I think all these people care about in Vegas is that young people come through those doors, and ultimately they're going to put money into the slot machine or down on the table, as well as watching the esports. So it's that attraction. You know, it's kind of like an entertainment center more than it is an esports destination or an online place where there's a lot of gaming going on. But it's just another element to the business. So I suspect you know, they'll continue their place there. There's another dozen major facilities being built around the country. There's one in Austin and a couple in Shanghai. It's going on everywhere. They're purpose building brand new facilities just for esports. So something's going on that side for sure. You know, at that kind of high end league, big event level. But the real business of esports is online. It's streaming. It's, you know, it's interactivity. The things we talked about earlier. That's where the groundswell is. The fact that these guys want to all link themselves on because they're going to put a cool place in Vegas, that's great, but it's not really the be all end all of the business. In fact, it's kind of just, you know, one little tangent into more of the exhibition side of things. That the stuff we're doing with My Cinema at Niagara, you know, we're putting out. I don't, you know, can't tell you the numbers, but it's going to be in, you know, in the hundreds of locations that are in theaters doing the same thing they're doing at Vegas, and then now you have a local community. Where you can go and watch the event, and you don't have to fly to Vegas and hope there's an event going on the day you're there. You can go any day of the week, in especially any given Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday, where, you know, there's going to be a tournament of some sort going on, and you can sit with your local chums and enjoy the event, and, you know, it's more local. So there's that too. So there's lots of elements going on in esports. I think we all should keep our eyes on it, because it's definitely going to push our streaming business to its limits.
I was going to add to that. You talked about it being a single venue where they're streaming out the content from. Think about the way that the World Series of Poker works. I mean, people play poker all over the world, but ultimately what they do is they attempt to gather the best of the best in regions and then up to a single location. So that may be the venue competition that you're talking about, Darcy, that the Vegas level, they're willing to put big prize packages together to attract people to show up, just like they do for the rodeo, like they do for the World Series of Poker, etc. And then that becomes, to Mark's point, it becomes a scale issue. Then there is a huge latency question because of the betting, but ultimately it also becomes, how do you get it out to hundreds of millions of people watching it at any given time for that sort of main event? So.
Super League is one that I really like their model. I mean, I'm not saying it just because they like theaters, but ultimately they took that approach. They started local. They built local audiences. They embraced the community. You know, most of the gamers are in those communities that they've started to roll out in. And like you said, so the Super League Championships, it makes sense for that to be in Vegas, just like anything else. It's you know, it's the Super Bowl effect. So but the guys in Vegas don't think that way. They're thinking, you know, it's destination. People are going to fly to. People are going to fly there. They're going to gamble and they're going to do all this.
Sure.
The jury's out on that, but good for them to continue to create awareness. Who cares where the awareness is being raised, whether it's in Vegas or whether it's local in these theaters or it's online on Twitch. The groundswell is there, and if people ignore it, you know, the only people reaping the benefits are the ones who are paying attention right now.
And as we know, with Ready Player One, Columbus, Ohio apparently can factor into that even as well. So, so Eric, I want to just come really quickly to you with one topic. I'm going to come to Dom with one more topic, and then we're going to come back to Eric for something about Stream Media East. So, Eric, one of the Flipboard topics was music, and how music revenues now are 43% from streaming, which is killing off, as I understand, sort of the physical downloads. But how do we explain the rise of vinyl? Is there a peaceful coexistence between analog, kind of to Dom's analogy of the RCA plug, alongside streaming music? And will vinyl become a factor again in terms of number of albums sold, or is it just so niche that it's not going to be really an issue?
I think it's just so niche that it's not going to really be an issue. There are people who fetishize the sound of vinyl. There are people who fetishize the object of the vinyl record album. There's a certain communal aspect that people enjoy going to record stores. You know, the annual record store day, which I believe was just this past weekend or a couple weekends ago, was always a huge deal. But you know, in the grand scheme of things, it's still going to be a relatively small piece of the overall music revenue pie. And I think in terms of the advances that streaming has made, you know, what that reflects is a number of things. It reflects that that consumers are now more comfortable consuming most of their music that way. Many consumers now have unlimited data on their phones, so they can listen to all the music they want to and not have to worry about how much bandwidth they're using up. You know, and of course, I'll always come back to my pet peeve is that there's still a relatively small amount of this money that's getting back to the artists, but same as it ever was, I suppose.
Sure. Yeah. And what was ironic, though, is Spotify, of course, did their first quarter announcement and didn't do super well. So I think what we have is the idea of streaming itself being the mode of consumption, but whether we've got the top three engines for that in place now, or if we're in early days, I think sort of remains to be seen as well. So, Dom, real quick on Netflix, you'd mentioned that there was an EU regulation passing something about content.
Let me dig it out. Yeah, while I dig that out, actually, just to comment on the. So I'm going to bring up an EU regulatory change while we're talking, but I'm also going to just on the previous topic on the music stuff. In the stateside, you just had the Music Modernization Act unanimously passed in the House of Representatives. I'm not quite sure how far up the food chain that gets before somebody blocks it, but there's clearly some at a leadership level some attempt to reorganize the royalty process so that what is it, Sound Exchange in the States can actually do something fair for artists and so on. You know, I think I was at the Brighton Music Conference locally to me last week, and there's still a funny, you know, the BPI were the British Phonographic Institute were talking about their uphill battle at trying to prosecute everybody that they could possibly get any data on, and how incredibly futile it was to actually try to do so, and so on. And I think it just feels like
I'm not sure, Dom, who hates my articles more, Christopher Levy or Sound Exchange, because we've actually, when we've written about Sound Exchange in the past, Eric knows this, I mean, we've gotten really nasty letters from them saying, you're misrepresenting what we're doing. No, we're representing exactly what you're doing. That's the problem.
I think, I mean, over here we have the MCPS PRS, they're the equivalent body, and they talk about legal prosecution, and they talk about law as if they are lawyers or a police force. And one has to always remember that these bodies are rackets. They are literally, in the explicit sense of what a racket is, they are rackets. They turn up, they force bars and pubs and record stations and music on hold services to pay a license as if it's a tax, to give them money, which they then promise to distribute, but they have no mechanism whatsoever to allocate the money. And so the money always gets allocated to their members. And it totally excludes independent artists. It totally excludes so many other people, and it blocks innovation in that space like the most fierce monopoly, and it is pure racketeering. So I hope the Music Modernisation Act brings some change to thinking in that space, but it just smacks of the RIAA and MP3.com 17 years ago to me. Excuse me being outspoken as ever,
no,
but
it's putting the foxes, it's making sure the foxes remain in charge of the hen house again.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is actually a topic I think we really ought to come back to in another SMAF as well, because it is something that several of us are passionate about on both sides of the pond. Real quick though, Dom, Netflix.
Yep. So let me share the article. So basically, it was an interesting story out on our Flipboard. So this was the story. I'm trying to scroll the Hangout here. Right. This is the story. Basically, Netflix and Amazon are being obligated to maintain a minimum content quota of at least 30% from Europe. What was a couple of interesting things? Darcy, it might have been you. Somebody commented when we put that out on the social feeds that they thought it meant that the data itself, 30% of their data had to be stored in Europe on their storage servers. It's not about that. It's about producing content in Europe, about European content, and it is interesting. What I think what they're fundamentally trying to do is drive innovation in the broadcast market and the production houses locally in different regions. So it's not just America.
This to me smacks of the French cinema problem, which was in France a number of years ago. You could only show a certain number of non-French films. And what happened was there were many ways to skirt around it from a loophole standpoint, and ultimately it got dropped. Is this just Europe saying we want to be relevant from the production standpoint, or is it Europe saying we need to show German content, French content, Dutch content, etc.?
It's false defense, I think.
It is a French cinema thing. Sorry, Darcy, go ahead.
They're definitely putting up a defense on the cinema movie side. And I don't know if you saw the other thing about Netflix looking at buying their own chain of cinemas so they could get, keep themselves in both sides of the business. So, Canada's got the same thing as France, by the way. I'm sure you guys have UK regulations. When I had the BBC, I remember many of these things. So I don't know why they're putting up the defense. I mean, I think they should embrace everything that's creative in terms of movies and film.
It's probably worth highlighting that there's so many mixed parts of that article and what was being talked about. They mentioned terrorism and protecting children and so on and so forth. There's a little bit of watching the congressman sitting interviewing Zuckerberg. It's kind of, look at me, I'm on TV with Zuckerberg. It's kind of, let's just throw a load of acronyms into this regulation that seem important, and maybe someone will take notice of us. Guys, we're running into the last couple of minutes, and there's an important plug that Eric's got to give out. And actually, before we hand it to before I step away, vote for me because while I'm in the States at what Eric's about to plug, you've also got to vote for me because the conference over here has got an award going on, and I've been nominated. Some fool has nominated me for
best soul patch. Is that what it is?
That's it. Yeah, best blagger. And after what I've been saying on this SMAF, I probably won't get the award. But TV Connect People's Choice Award. So get out and vote for me because apparently I'm doing all right. But there you go. Anyway, Eric, Tim, Eric, over to you guys.
Eric, we'll let you take it out.
Yeah, I just want to remind everyone that Streaming Media East and the Content Delivery Summit are happening in New York next week. You can register right up until you get there. You can register on site if you want, but if you follow my Twitter feed or want to contact me, I can give you a discount for a couple $100 off of registration as well. It's going to be a great event with Facebook, Netflix, and Google giving keynotes and our usual great mix of business and technology, as well as this year we're adding some focus on marketing and advertising. So really looking forward to next week. Tim will be there. Dom will be there. Mark and Darcy, are you going to be there?
Maybe.
Okay.
I have a race things to do this weekend, so as long as we survive the weekend and we don't crash cars, I'll be there.
All right.
Yeah, unfortunately, no. I was just in New York, and I'll be in New York again for Upfronts. And Streaming Media East used to coincide with Upfronts. What happened? That was a logical thing there. Do we know?
All the conferences are converging at the moment.
No, exactly. There's too many conferences, first of all. And second of all, it all comes down to hotel availability.
Ah, gotcha. Well, that makes sense.
Cool, guys. Tim's doing that whirly bird thing, so I'm going to wrap us up there because we've gone about a minute and a half over, and we've been pretty good until now. So this is our longest show we've done. I'll see Erica, Tim. I'll see you on Sunday. Darcy, maybe, and Mark. You're not going to come to the conference that's got your namesake, so we'll see you at Streaming Media Not East. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Darcy. Been really good to have you on, and we'll speak soon.
Great. Thank you very much.